Kia ora. Hello. Welcome back to Medieval Sewing Made Super Easy, where we show you the basics of sewing to help you improve your impression and skills and save you some money as well. I have my crafting jumper on, so let's get to it. In this episode, I'm going to cover how to cut out fabric that we had marked out in our last episode of the series. As you can remember, we had 3 shapes, 2 squares and one with a convex and concave curve. I had to add seam allowance on 2 of my patterns and one of them was cut on the bias. Now they are all marked out, let's hop in and have a look. Before we start cutting away at the fabric, it is best to talk about how to use our scissors. As we discussed in our video talking about the basic tools needed to sew, fabric scissors are a bit different to paper scissors. I'm going to use a bit of scrap fabric here to show you some tips on how to get a nice straight clean edge. What I'm going to do first is show you what not to do. When cutting fabric, you want to keep your work on a nice flat surface. You really don't want to have it in air like I have here. You don't want to use the front of the scissors while cutting either. You only want to use the front to cut nice turns or snip off the end of a cut. The shorter your cut is, the more likely it is to be wobbly or jagged. For a long cut, you want to start at the middle of your scissors or shears. Don't choke up the back of the throat. Your work might clog or fold and you will get a jagged edge. Let's have a look how a nice straight cut should look like before we start cutting out. Place your work nice and flat on your work surface. Start your fabric in the middle of the scissors and start your cut. Don't close your scissors entirely. This will result in a bad cut. Open them again and while keeping the work flat, move forward back to the middle of the scissors. Take it slow. This is not a race. This will give you a nice straight cut. If you cut too hard and close down on the scissors, see how the cut veers off? You probably want to avoid that. So let's have a look at following the pattern now. In the last episode, I've marked this all out. If you want to see how I did that, head over there and see how. As you can see, I make sure that the fabric is nice and flat. Don't lift your fabric into the air. Maintain the point of your scissors on your cutting surface. I place my work in the middle of my scissors and start to cut following my pattern line. I hold my work straight, not taut, avoiding pulling on it too hard. What you want to do is to avoid the piece from stretching. So you can see I have a nice straight cut. Once you have cut to the end of the line, you want to overcut slightly, say by about 3 millimeters or so. This allows you to turn back the waste edge and you can begin your new cut without distorting the lay of the fabric. See, again I am just holding the fabric lightly. I'm not tugging on it. I again follow the line. At the end of the line, I do not overcut this time. Instead, I run right to the end of the pattern. I control this cut with the middle of my scissors, not with the ends. I now run the same cut along the final side, connecting to the fabric, running through the smallest amount of waste to do so. I usually prefer to remove the pattern from the bulk of the fabric if possible first. This is a personal preference. As you can see here, I follow the pattern piece and at the end to cut off, I will overcut slightly. That means there will be only 1 overcut for each corner, not 2. This leaves cleaner fabric when you are looking for scraps. I clean up the final edge, which is done as the same as the other pieces. I would like to add, since this is a square and I have moved it, I no longer know the grain line or know the inside or outside of the fabric. I would normally use some kind of marking, such as a notch on the top and the bottom to mark the grain or pin a note as to the outside of the face of the fabric. We'll cover these notations in a later episode, don't worry. But there you go, one nicely cut out square. Next, we're going to look at the fabric we marked out on the bias. As we know, fabric on the bias pulls and stretches, so we want to make sure we are not tugging on it too much. Pulling too much will distort the fabric and the cut. Make sure your work is nice and flat and straight before cutting. When or if holding the fabric, use firm pressure. So, why am I starting on this line? No real reason. It was just the line in front of me. As you can see, I'm lifting the edge of the fabric only slightly. This helps relieve the tension on the fabric and stop the scissors from catching and creating that horrible jagged edge which we don't want. This time I was working towards the end of the pattern. As I was making my way down the scissors, when I reached the end, I cut off with the tip of the scissors to avoid overcutting. I did this purely so I did not need to move more of the fabric into the middle of the scissors, and again, as you are more confident, you will be able to make cuts like this. If you are halfway through your cut and snip off, you will need to start your cut again. This is to be avoided because you will most likely result in a jagged edge unless you can align your cut exactly. We don't want any jagged cuts. A slightly wobbly line is fine though. Don't worry about that. Even though I started at a really silly point, I still want my fabric to be flat. If I left the fabric twisted and cut it, it could still lead to some uneven cuts. Until I remove the pattern from the fabric, the point that is now cut in there is where the fabric rotates from. This pivot point is where the fabric will rotate. You can now use these to get access to a tricky cut by cutting into the fabric from that point and turning it to where you want to work. This, however, is very wasteful. I flatten things out and start my next series of cuts. As you can see, I'm making sure I'm keeping the fabric nice and flat. If there is a little turn from the corner where I made the initial cut, that's fine. What will really cause problems is if I pull on the fabric during the pattern making process or while cutting. When I get to the final corner, again, you can see I overcut slightly near the middle of the scissors. There we go, all cut out, and now you can see this piece stretches along the bias on each corner, but not along the straight grain. Finally, we have our complex shape. Well, not that complex. To get at those curves, you want to use the points of your scissors more. As I have already looked at straight cuts, let's just jump into cutting curves. As you can see here, I'm following the line of the pattern with the front of the scissors now. I am not closing up on them. I'm making small cuts. Once again, a tight turn, I move back into the scissors. This is not the very tips, just the front corner. You'll notice here, I'm lifting the back of the work to make room for my hand. And the scissors. This is okay. Remember not to pull on the work. If you need to turn the work around to find the correct angle, do so. Just make sure that the work you are cutting is kept flat. As the next point gets too tight to get to, I want to get to that from the other direction. I could get to that by cutting into my excess fabric and opening up a wide pivot point in the fabric to get to it, but that would be wasteful. Much easier to cut at it from the other direction. So we follow the pattern around. At the end, I overcut a little. That lets me rotate the pattern a little bit more to get a nice angle on the last bit just to trim up. Now, if we have a quick look at all of this, we can see a few pieces that need to be trimmed up. However, they're just overhanging, not cut into the seam allowance, so this is easily fixed. Depending on the sewing construction method and the project, I might not even bother to fix them up. If this were modern clothing and I was using, say, an overlocker, I wouldn't even care. So how did I do on this one? Looks pretty good and unintentionally like a cat's head. It has all the seam allowances all included and not too wonky. Yep, it's good enough for jazz. So when you fold back the seam allowance, the top will come up at a nice fine point like the pattern. There you go, our three shapes. If you want a bit of practice marking and cutting out, I've scanned the pattern and made a PDF and will post it on Modern Medieval Man on Facebook so you can have a bit of practice with the last two lessons. So there you go, 3 pieces of fabric all cut out. They're not deformed, warped, or have any sharp edges. Now, if you end up with a jagged edge, don't sweat it too much. Much of that can be trimmed or hidden under a felled seam. What you really don't want to do is cut into your seam allowance. The smaller your seam allowance, the less meat you have for your stitches to bite into, and this can result into seams failing. Now that you've watched the last 2 episodes, you will be able to lay out, mark up, and cut out a pattern. Follow your pattern instructions. Many patterns might include a layout guide as well. Make sure to add any seam allowances if needed. If you do this, you will have a successful time when you go to sew. Oh, hi. I didn't see you there. This must mean you enjoyed the video. So, like, comment, and subscribe. And remember, stay safe, have fun, and keep reenacting.